Good morning from New Hampshire on this long Independence Day weekend. It's a beautiful day here in New Hampshire, and we have some family coming and to spend the night. They're going to be coming later on today, so I thought this morning, good time to do this podcast. This is Marshall Davis, and today I'm going to be talking about perfect peace. Non-dual awareness is the peace that surpasses understanding. To quote the Apostle Paul, the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. There's a scene in the Gospels where the disciples are in a boat on the Sea of Galilee with Jesus. And it says a great windstorm arose and the waves were swamping the boat. Jesus is sleeping through it all in the stern of the boat. And the ship adds the interesting detail that he's resting on a pillow. And that's to emphasize how deep and restful his sleep is. The disciples of Jesus are scared and angry. They wake Jesus up and say, "Don't you care that we are perishing?" On a deep level, I think this points to the classic problem of suffering and evil. Don't you care, God, that bad things are happening? In the story, Jesus arises and rebukes the wind and says to the sea, "Peace, be still," and the wind ceases and there's a great calm. And then Jesus turns to the disciples and says, "Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?" And the story ends with the words, "And they feared exceedingly and said to one another, 'Who can this be, that even the wind and the sea obey him?'" This is a wonderful story about the peace of God, the peace of divine awareness, kingdom consciousness, non-dual awareness. Is always present, simply a matter of abiding in it. Jesus and the disciples were literally in the same boat. They were in the same situation. They were in the same physical danger. But their attitude toward the situation could not have been more different. The disciples were scared to death. Jesus, who is the embodiment of Christ consciousness, is in perfect peace. It brings to mind that wonderful saying of the prophet Isaiah, "Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee." Now this story is not just talking about the fear of physical danger. Even after Jesus stills the storm, the gospel writer points out the disciples are still afraid. Although now they're no longer afraid of the storm, but they are afraid of the one who stilled the storm. Jesus says here, not "Why were you so fearful?" but "Why are you so fearful?" They're still afraid. And then come the words, "And they feared exceedingly and said to one another, 'Who can this be, that even the wind and the sea obey him?'" This points to a deeper existential fear that is at the root of life and even the root of the spiritual life. People want salvation, liberation, enlightenment, spiritual awakening, whatever you want to call it. The peace, the solution to the existential problem of the human condition. But we are afraid of the solution because we know that it means the death of the self. And this is something that people are afraid of. They want peace, but don't want to pay the price for peace, which is the death of the ego, the loss of self. I'm talking about this today because it has been in the forefront of my mind the last week or so. We recently returned from spending a week with our daughter and her family, her husband and her 12-year-old son who live outside of Pittsburgh. Our grandson is having some psychological issues. His therapist is pretty sure he has Asperger's syndrome, a form of autism spectrum disorder. and he'll be tested soon for that. They've already made the appointment. Now, this kid is brilliant, but he has a very hard time socializing in school. He was bullied a lot. Now he's doing cyber school. He's been in cyber school for the last year. He has a hard time relating to people. And the whole situation has been very emotionally taxing for our daughter. They were going to be spending a week with us here this summer in New Hampshire, but they canceled that. They were just too stressed out to try to take the trip. So instead we took the 700-mile automobile trip out to see them. All the time I was there, I noticed the emotional stress that they were going through, and with good reason. The whole thing was a difficult situation. At the same time I was observing that, I was aware of this calm space that I was dwelling in, that was around all of us all the time. It's a constant sense of deep peace. It felt like the eye of a storm. Maybe that metaphor came to mind because I was also reading at the time John Grissom's novel Camino Winds, which is about a hurricane that hit an island off the coast of Florida. Peace is always present, but it was especially obvious to me when I was also aware of how much the people around me, the people that I love, my family, were caught up in the storm and did not seem to notice the peace that is present right there in the midst of, in the middle of the storm. Now, this does not mean that I did not have any emotional reactions during the time I was in Pennsylvania. I did. But the emotions all happened in the context of the omnipresent peace that surpasses human understanding. The ego cannot understand this peace. The self cannot experience it because the self is caught up in the storm, in the wind and the waves. The self is the storm. But when we are not identifying with the storm of the personal self, then the peace that is in the midst of, in the eye of the self, is the dominant reality of awareness. This is what the Buddha was talking about as the end of suffering. It's not an escape from suffering. Many people, I think, begin the spiritual search to escape psychological suffering. This perfect peace is not such an escape. It is dwelling in the peace that is present amid suffering. That's the symbolism of the cross. At first glance, it seems like the picture of the Buddha under the Bodhi tree and the picture of Christ on the cross are very different approaches to suffering. But they're not. They're just focusing on different aspects of the same reality. One focuses on peace in the midst of suffering. The other focuses on suffering in the midst of peace. In the story of Jesus stilling the storm, the disciples were focusing on the storm. Jesus was focusing on the peace. He is the embodiment of peace. The disciples focused on fear, especially fear of death. And Jesus focused on stillness in the midst of the storm of fear and death. The same with the cross. Both peace and suffering were happening on the cross. Jesus was suffering and dying on the cross. And he refused to escape from that by coming down off the cross. Instead, he dwelt in peace, even amid suffering and approaching death. Life is suffering and death. You cannot escape from it. Everything that lives suffers. That was the Buddha's first noble truth. Life is suffering. That's also the message of the cross. Take up your cross and follow me, said Jesus. Everything that is born dies. Every creature that experiences pleasure also experiences pain. That is the nature of duality. But non-duality includes, and at the same time transcends, all such dualities. That is the non-dual peace that surpasses understanding, because it surpasses dualism. It cannot be understood by the dualistic mind, but it can be experienced. This is perfect peace, holistic peace, the peace of wholeness, the peace of holiness, holy peace, shalom, non-dual peace. That is the peace of unitive awareness. And that is it for today. Grace and peace to you.